Hi, boys and girls. This is Grandma Sheilla, and our story today is called The Burned Pants. Well, Dan went to talk to his mother, and he said, "Mother, can I go on a hike with the fellas?" Mother said, "Well, where would you go?" And he said, "Well, we want to go down to the beach because John has found a shorter way to hike there." Well, Mother said, "All right, I'll make an agreement with you. If you don't get in that water, it's too cold, so no swimming. If you promise me you won't go swimming, you can go with the guys." Well, Dan was so excited. He'd already told his two friends that he was going to come even before he asked Mother. So he was really excited. He went to get his hiking boots on, and Mother went in the kitchen, and she made a substantial lunch as fast as she could. You know, she was getting pretty good at this, making a lunch in just a wink of time. Well, after Dan got his hiking boots on, he went rushing out to where the boys were waiting for him. Now, that was John and Harold that he was going to meet. And it wasn't long till they were crawling through a great big huge culvert. And that was the way that John had said was faster to get to the beach. Dan didn't think that was the best thing, but away he went. Well, on the other side of it, there was the beach, and there was the water just a little ways from it. Well, so far the boys hadn't talked about going swimming or anything, and when they saw the sand, they all got down in the sand and they started making a great big sand castle. And they worked on them and they worked on it till it was a beautiful thing to look at. And suddenly Harold said, "Let's go build a raft." And John thought that was a great thing, but Dan, he was hesitant about that. And the reason was, if you're going to build a raft, you had to go on the water. I wonder. And then he thought, well, Mother didn't say anything about rafts. So, when John and Harold got up and went over to the beach and started pulling some smaller logs and stuff, and some old rope that was laying down there, and some driftwood, they put it all together, and for a long time they worked to make that raft. Well, finally, John called over to Dan, and he said, "Are you afraid to get your footsies wet?" Well, then, Harold, he couldn't be outdone, and so he hollered up to Dan, "Does the little baby want to have some cars to play with?" Dan was trying to think about what he should do, and those two boys kept harassing him, just like he was a little boy that couldn't handle himself. Well, finally they called up to Dan and said, "We're not in the water, we're just building a raft." So Dan thought, well, that's okay. So he got up and he went over to help them build the raft. Well, some time went by as they all worked hard to hook that raft together so they could go sailing out into the to the sound, sorry. Well, then it was time to push it into the water. Harold got up on top, and John and Dan started pushing it. It took all their muscles to push it into those little lapping waves. Well, finally, they got it in there. Well, Dan, he looked down in his feet, and his pant legs were a little wet, but he thought, that's not swimming. So he jumped up on the raft with Harold and John, and they had a couple poles that they had found to push them along. Well, the waves were helping them get out, and Harold kept saying, we need to get out into deep water so we can sail better. Well, Dan was having fun, and he kind of went, yippee, this is great. Well, that raft was going on down. There was no danger that they would go out into the ocean from there because there was a big sandbar that now, since it was getting later in the day, it was covered with white foam about 3 feet up over it, so they couldn't accidentally go out into the ocean. But the tide had changed, and so now there were bigger waves going out to the shore. Dan thought, well, maybe they should go back. So they started pushing with those poles, and the waves were bigger that could try to help carry them. But when they pushed with the poles, they were pushing against the waves now. And the waves were coming toward that raft. The boys were having so much fun that they didn't notice that the rope was starting to let go, and the raft was about to break up. But they didn't notice that right away until 2 of the logs inside just came apart from the rope like this, and Dan fell right through the hole. Well, when he came up out of the water, he discovered at least it wasn't over his head, but it came right to his armpits. Well, he told Mother he wouldn't swim, so he waded through that water back to the shore. And the boys tried, well, they gathered one of the old boards that had been up on top, and they put it sideways across what logs they had left and tried to keep it together till they got to the shore. Well, when they got there, they said, well, you know what we should do? We should put it all back together. It was fun. But Dan, he was standing there, and that water had been really cold. And he was just shaking. And he said, couldn't somebody come help me build a fire so I can get dried off and get warm? So John and Harold went with Dan up to the higher sand where there was dry driftwood, and they gathered some pieces of that, and they built a little fire right there on the sand. And Dan, he got really close, but it wasn't warm enough, so the boys came with more driftwood to make the fire bigger. But Dan, he wasn't drying off very fast. Well, the other guys said, hey, we're going to go back and work on the raft. But before they left, Harold turned to Dan and he said, why don't you take off your pants and stretch a big stick out over the fire and put your pants on the stick and they should dry out. So Dan did that. He put a stick into the sand that kind of bent over, and he hooked his pants up here so they were hanging down over that nice little fire they had built. Dan, he didn't want to miss getting to play with the raft some more, and he figured he was wet already, so he went back down to the shore to help the boys get the raft put back together. Finally, they did, and Dan pushed them into the water, and he thought, it was fun. So he jumped on the raft as well. Harold kept saying, let's go to deeper water. But, of course, they were going against the waves. They didn't have a motor, and even their poles didn't get them very far. So Harold, he turned to Dan and he said, you be the motor. So Dan, he got in that water again and he pushed the raft while the other two boys rode on it. Now Dan was really, really cold, and when they got the raft back to shore, Dan's teeth were just chattering together, and he said, I'm going back to the fire. Well, when he turned around to run up on that sand, he saw something, and he started to yell, guys, come help me. Help me, my pants are on fire. Well, Dan ran up to that fire, and the other two boys came, and Dan pulled his pants off, and he held them up, and both legs had burnt off, and part of the center of the pants had burned out. Oh, what was he going to do? What was he going to tell Mother? The boys, they looked all up and down the beach, trying to find something that Dan could cover up his body with. Well, they didn't find anything. So then they went over the sandbar to the garbage dump, and they looked, and finally they found a long strip of roofing paper. And as Dan stood there with his arms up, they wrapped that roofing paper around him, and Dan held on to it tightly. Well, Harold and John looked at Dan, and they burst into laughter. I mean, here was Dan with no pants, with just that roofing paper wrapped around him. Boys and girls, sometimes Satan uses the people that we think are our friends to lead us into temptation. We don't even know that we're being led into temptation, but Satan knows how to make people say things, and things that will make us want to do what we know we're not supposed to. Well, the story doesn't tell how Dan told his mother about the fact that he was all wet and how his pants got burnt up. And it doesn't say what Dan thought after that about those two boys that were supposed to be his friends. But we do know that that evening in that house, Dan learned a big lesson. Thank you, boys and girls, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye now.